There's a woman in the Bible who did something Abraham never did, Moses never did, David, Solomon, and every prophet after her never did. She looked at God, and she gave him a name, not a title someone taught her, a personal name she invented in the moment, born from her own encounter with the divine, and the biblical authors preserved it for over 3,000 years. Her name was Hagar. If you grew up in church, you probably heard her mentioned once. The footnote in Abraham's story. So why did God choose her to be the first person in all of Scripture visited by an angel? That question changes the way you read the entire Bible. If you'd asked anyone in the ancient Near East about Hagar around 2000 BCE, they would have told you she was property, not a person. Property. She was an Egyptian slave in the household of a wealthy nomadic chieftain named Abram, before God changed his name to Abraham, and his wife Sarai, before she became Sarah. Now here's something most English Bibles completely miss. The Hebrew word used for Hagar in the early chapters of her story is shipcha, and that word is specific. It doesn't just mean servant or handmaid, the way your translation probably renders it. Shipcha refers to a female slave who belongs to another woman, not to the household, not to the husband, to the wife specifically. Hagar was Sarah's personal property. That distinction matters enormously because it tells us something about the power dynamics that get ignored in nearly every sermon you'll hear on this passage. Sarah had total authority over Hagar. Abraham didn't own her, Sarah did. And the decisions Sarah made about Hagar's body, her future, and her children were legally and culturally within her rights. Think about what that means for a second. In the world Hagar lived in, she had no legal standing, no voice, no ability to refuse an order. If Sarah told her to do something, she did it. If Sarah decided her fate, that fate was sealed. And the ancient world was full of women like Hagar. Egypt, Mesopotamia, Canaan, every civilization in the Fertile Crescent ran on slave labor. We know from archaeological records, from clay tablets found in places like Nutsi and Mari in modern-day Iraq, that female slaves were routinely given to wives as part of marriage dowries. Their bodies were considered an extension of their mistress's household resources. So when Genesis chapter 16 opens with Sarah unable to conceive a child, and she turns to Hagar and says, essentially, "You will bear a child for me," that wasn't unusual. It wasn't scandalous. It was standard legal practice across the ancient Near East. The Nutsi tablets from roughly the same period describe this exact arrangement. A barren wife could give her female slave to her husband, and the child born from that union would legally belong to the wife, not the slave. Hagar had no choice in this, none. And this is where you have to resist the temptation to sanitize this story. A lot of Bible commentaries treat this moment as Abraham and Sarah making a reasonable decision within their cultural context. And culturally, yes, it was normal. But the text itself is doing something far more interesting than just reporting cultural norms. The text is setting up a collision between human systems of power and God's habit of showing up exactly where human systems say he shouldn't. Because here's the pattern that runs through the entire Bible, from Genesis to Revelation. God consistently shows up for the person at the bottom, the overlooked one, the discarded one, the one with no legal standing, no social power, no voice. And Hagar is the first time we see that pattern play out. Now, Sarah's plan works, at least on the surface. Hagar conceives. She's carrying Abraham's child, and something shifts in the household dynamic. Genesis 16 verse 4 says that when Hagar knew she was pregnant, her mistress was despised in her eyes. The Hebrew here is fascinating. The word is kalal, and it can mean to despise, but it can also mean to become light, to become diminished. Some scholars read this not as Hagar actively disrespecting Sarah, but as Sarah losing weight, losing significance in Hagar's perception. The power dynamic has shifted. Hagar is carrying the air, Sarah isn't, and Sarah feels it immediately. What comes next is brutal. Genesis 16 verse 6 says Abraham tells Sarah, "Your slave is in your hands. Do with her as you please." The Hebrew word for what Sarah does to Hagar is Anna. Remember that word, because it's going to come back later in the most unexpected way. Anna means to afflict, to oppress, to deal harshly with. It's the exact same word used in Exodus to describe what Egypt did to the Israelites during their slavery. The irony is staggering. Sarah, the future mother of the nation that will be enslaved in Egypt, is using Egyptian-level oppression against her own Egyptian slave. The text is drawing a direct linguistic line between Sarah's treatment of Hagar and Pharaoh's treatment of Israel. Nobody in Sunday school ever mentions that. And this is where Hagar does something extraordinary, something that, in the ancient world, was almost suicidal for a pregnant slave. She runs. Genesis 16 verse 6 says, "She fled from her face. She fled from Sarah's presence." A pregnant slave, alone, heading south through the Negev desert toward the road to Shur, which was the ancient trade route back to Egypt. She was trying to go home, back to a country she may have been taken from as a girl, back to the only other life she'd ever known. Think about the desperation required to make that decision. She's pregnant. She's in the desert. She has no water, no food, no protection. The Negev in that era was wild territory, full of bandits and predators. A woman alone on that road was almost certainly walking toward death. And this is the moment when something happens that had never happened before in the entire biblical narrative. An angel shows up. Now, we need to stop and understand something about what's happening here, because the text is doing something that the original audience would have found absolutely shocking. Up to this point in Genesis, God has spoken directly to Adam, to Eve, to Cain, to Noah, to Abraham. But every single one of those conversations followed a pattern. God spoke to people who had standing, people with names that carried weight, people who mattered in the social order. And in every case, God spoke directly. No intermediary, no messenger. What happens here is different. For the very first time in the entire Bible, a figure called the Angel of the Lord appears. The Hebrew is Malach Yahweh, and this figure, this divine messenger who will show up again and again throughout Scripture, makes his first appearance not to a patriarch, not to a priest, not to a king. He appears to a pregnant runaway slave sitting by a spring in the middle of the desert. The angel of the Lord finds her at a spring of water in the wilderness, near the spring on the road to Shur. And the angel asks her two questions. "Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going?" Pay attention to what the angel calls her. Hagar, servant of Sarai. The angel uses her name. In the ancient world, slaves often weren't addressed by name. They were addressed by function. "Girl, slave, you there." But the angel calls her by her name and then identifies her relationship, not to diminish her, but to show that God knows exactly who she is and exactly what situation she's in. And Hagar answers honestly, "I'm running away from my mistress Sarai." She doesn't dress it up, doesn't make excuses, doesn't try to spin the situation. She's fleeing abuse, and she says so directly. What the angel says next is complicated, and we need to sit with it for a moment. The angel tells her to go back and submit to Sarah, And I know that's hard to hear. It sounds like God is telling an abused woman to return to her abuser. And honestly, scholars have wrestled with this passage for centuries. But look at the context. Hagar is pregnant, alone in the desert, heading toward a journey of hundreds of miles through hostile territory. The likelihood of her surviving that trip and reaching Egypt was close to zero. And the angel doesn't just say, "Go back." The angel gives her something nobody else in her world had given her: a promise. "I will multiply your descendants so that they cannot be counted for multitude." Stop and think about who's receiving this promise. This is the same kind of promise God made to Abraham in Genesis 15. "Look at the stars, so shall your offspring be." And now God is making an almost identical promise to Abraham's Egyptian slave, a woman who, in her society, had no right to own property, make decisions, or claim descendants of her own. God is treating her like a matriarch. The angel continues, "You are pregnant and will bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has heard your affliction." The name Ishmael. In Hebrew, it's Yishmael. Yishma means he hears. El means God. Ishmael literally translates to God hears. And look at what God heard. He heard her affliction, and the word used for affliction here is onyi, which comes from the same root as Anna, the word used to describe what Sarah did to her. The circle closes perfectly. Sarah afflicted Hagar. God heard the affliction, and the child's name will be a permanent reminder that when a slave cried out in pain, the God of Abraham was listening. This is the part of the story where most commentaries move on. They note the angel's appearance, summarize the promise, and get back to Abraham. But the text has one more moment, and it's arguably the most theologically significant verse in the entire chapter. Genesis 16, verse 13. "She gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. You are El Roi, for she said, I have now seen the one who sees me." Read that again, slowly. She gave a name to God. In the ancient Near East, naming something meant you had authority over it, or at the very least, a relationship with it profound enough to define it. Adam named the animals. Parents named children. Conquerors renamed conquered cities. Naming was an act of power, of identity, of intimate knowledge. And a runaway Egyptian slave looks at the divine presence and says, "You are El Roi." The Hebrew is dense with meaning. El is God. Roi comes from the root ra'ah, which means to see. But Roi specifically can mean the one who sees me, or the God of my seeing, or even the God whom I have seen. The phrase works in multiple directions simultaneously. God sees her, she sees God. The seeing is mutual. No one else in the Bible does this. Abraham didn't name God. Moses received God's name at the burning bush, but he didn't generate one. David praised God with many titles, but didn't coin a new name from personal experience. Hagar stands alone in all of Scripture as the only person who encountered the divine and responded by naming what she experienced. And the name she chose, it wasn't about power. It wasn't about creation or judgment or sovereignty. It was about being seen. You are the God who sees me. Now I want you to think about why that specific name, out of all possible names, was the one she chose. She could have said El Shaddai, God Almighty, if she was impressed by his power. She could have called him El Elyon, God Most High, if she was overwhelmed by his majesty. But she didn't reach for power words. She reached for intimacy. The thing that mattered most to Hagar, the thing that defined her experience of the divine. was that she had been seen by someone, by anyone. After a life of being invisible, of being property, of being a body used for someone else's purposes, the most radical thing God could do was simply look at her, and she recognized it immediately. There's something here that goes beyond theology and ancient history, something that's probably hitting closer to home than you expected. Because if you've ever felt invisible, if you've ever been in a situation where nobody sees the real you, where you're just a function, just a role, just a means to someone else's end, then Hagar's name for God isn't academic. It's personal. El Roi, the God who sees me, not the collective me, not the generic humanity, me, specifically, individually, with all my mess, all my running, all my desperation. That's the God Hagar discovered in the desert. And she marks the spot. She names the well Bir Lahai Roi, which translates to the well of the living one who sees me. This well becomes a real geographical landmark in the biblical narrative. It shows up again later. And who eventually chooses to live near this well? Isaac, Abraham's other son, the son of the very woman who drove Hagar into the desert. Isaac makes his home at the well that Hagar named. The text never explains why Isaac chose that location, but the symbolism is extraordinary. The son of the promise settles at the place where the rejected woman met God. Pay attention to this next detail, because it explains everything about what comes later. Hagar goes back. She returns to Abraham's household and gives birth to Ishmael. And for about 13 years, everything is relatively calm. Ishmael grows up as Abraham's firstborn son. Abraham loves him. Genesis 17 makes that clear when Abraham pleads with God, "If only Ishmael might live under your blessing." Abraham isn't just tolerating this child, he loves him. But during those 13 years, something changes in Hagar's status that the original Hebrew tracks, but our translations completely miss. Remember when I said to pay attention to the word Shipchar? In the early part of the story, Hagar is called Shipchar, a female slave belonging to Sarah. But after Ishmael is born, the text starts shifting. In certain passages, Hagar is referred to as Amma instead. Amma is a different word entirely. While Shipchar means a slave who is property, Amma carries connotations of a secondary wife, a woman with some legal standing, someone whose children have inheritance rights. The shift from Shipchar to Amma tracks Hagar's changing position in the household. She's still subordinate to Sarah, but she's no longer just property. She's the mother of Abraham's son. And in the ancient Near East, that came with a degree of protection and status. English Bibles translate both words as servant or slave or handmaid. You lose the entire arc. You lose the fact that the text itself is tracking Hagar's slow ascent from object to person. The Hebrew writers were doing something deliberate here, and our translations flatten it completely. Then God drops a bombshell. Genesis 17. God tells Abraham that Sarah will bear a son. His name will be Isaac, and the covenant, the promise God made to Abraham about becoming a great nation, will pass through Isaac, not Ishmael. Abraham is 99 years old, Sarah is 90, and Abraham laughs. The text says he fell on his face and laughed. The Hebrew word for laughed is tzachak, and it's going to become important because Isaac's name, Yitzhak, comes from the same root. Isaac literally means he laughs. The laughter is baked into his identity. Isaac is born, and the celebration is massive. Abraham throws a great feast on the day Isaac is weaned, which in the ancient Near East could have been when the child was 2 or 3 years old. This was a big deal. The heir of the promise has arrived. The impossible has happened. And then Sarah sees something that reignites the entire conflict. Genesis 21, verse 9. Sarah sees Ishmael metzachek. That word again. The root is tzachak, to laugh. Sarah sees Ishmael laughing, or playing, or mocking. The Hebrew is deliberately ambiguous, and translators have fought over it for centuries. Some translations say Ishmael was mocking Isaac. Others say he was playing with Isaac. Others say he was simply laughing. The Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, adds, "with her son Isaac," making it sound like the two boys were playing together. But the ambiguity is the point. Sarah's reaction is disproportionate, regardless of what Ishmael was actually doing, because what Sarah says next is devastating. "Cast out this slave woman and her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not be heir with my son Isaac." Notice the language. Sarah doesn't say Hagar's name. She says, "this slave woman." She strips Hagar of her identity and reduces her back to her function. And she doesn't say Ishmael. She says, "the son of this slave woman." She won't even name them. She's dehumanizing them in language before she dehumanizes them in action. And look at what's driving Sarah here. It's not theology. It's not faith. It's inheritance law. She's terrified that Ishmael will claim a share of Abraham's wealth alongside Isaac. This is a property dispute dressed up as a family conflict. Now, Abraham is distraught. Genesis 21 verse 11 says the matter was very grievous in Abraham's sight because of his son, not because of his slave, because of his son. Abraham loves Ishmael. He doesn't want to do this. But God tells Abraham to listen to Sarah, and the reason God gives is important. "Through Isaac shall your offspring be named, but I will also make a nation of the son of the slave woman, because he is your offspring." God acknowledges two things simultaneously. Isaac carries the covenant line, and Ishmael is still Abraham's son, and still entitled to a divine promise of his own. God doesn't throw Ishmael away. God extends a separate promise to him. This isn't God choosing one and rejecting the other. It's God creating two paths from one family. And this is where the story enters its darkest chapter. Abraham gets up early in the morning. He takes bread and a skin of water. He puts them on Hagar's shoulder, and he gives her the child and sends them away. Read that scene carefully. Bread and a skin of water. That's it. For a journey into the wilderness of Beersheba, Abraham, one of the wealthiest men in Canaan, a man who had hundreds of servants and vast herds of livestock, sends the mother of his firstborn son into the desert with bread and a canteen. Was he being cruel? Was he following God's instruction precisely and no further? Was he afraid of Sarah? The text doesn't tell us what Abraham was feeling in that moment beyond grief. But the meagerness of what he provides is striking. He gives her enough to survive a day or two, not enough to build a life. And Hagar walks into the desert again. For the second time in her story, she's in the wilderness. But this time is different. The first time, she ran by choice. She was fleeing abuse, and she still had agency. She chose to leave. She chose the direction. She chose the road to Egypt. This time, she's been expelled. She didn't choose to leave. She was cast out. The Hebrew word is garash, and it's a legal term. It means to drive out, to divorce, to banish. It's the same word used when God banished Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden. The same word used when nations drive out their enemies. Hagar isn't running this time. She's been thrown away. The wilderness of Beersheba. If you've ever seen photos of the Negev desert in southern Israel, You know what this landscape looks like. Dry riverbeds called wadis that haven't seen water in months. Rocky terrain stretching to the horizon. Heat that turns the air into visible waves. And silence. The kind of silence that makes you hear your own heartbeat. Hagar wanders in this wilderness. The text says the water in the skin ran out, and she places her son under one of the desert shrubs for shade. Now, there's a detail here that scholars debate. Ishmael at this point should be around 16 or 17 years old, given the timeline in Genesis. He was born when Abraham was 86, and Abraham was 100 when Isaac was born. Isaac's weaning feast happened 2 or 3 years later. So Ishmael is a teenager, but the Hebrew text in Genesis 21 describes him almost as if he's a small child. Hagar casts him under the bush. She sits down a bow shot away because she doesn't want to watch him die. Some scholars think this is a narrative compression, the author treating Ishmael's age loosely to heighten the emotional impact. Others think the Hebrew verbs suggest a teenager who has collapsed from dehydration, and Hagar positions him in the best shade she can find before backing away. Either reading works. The emotional core is the same. Hagar sits down about 100 yards away, and she lifts her voice and weeps. The Hebrew word here is baka. It means to weep openly, loudly, with full-body grief. This isn't silent tears. This is the sound of a mother who has accepted that her child is going to die, and she cannot stop it. She's been here before. 14 or 15 years ago, she sat by a well in this same kind of wilderness, pregnant and alone and running, and God showed up. God spoke. God made promises. God saw her. But this time, she doesn't call out to God. She doesn't pray. She doesn't invoke El Roi, the name she herself gave to the divine. She just cries. And the text does something unexpected. Instead of saying that God heard Hagar's weeping, Genesis 21 verse 17 says, God heard the voice of the boy, Ishmael. God hears. The boy whose very name means God hears is the one whose voice God responds to in this moment. The name Hagar was given back in chapter 16, the name that encodes God's attention to suffering, activates here in the wilderness like a stored promise finally being cashed in. And God speaks. But not to Hagar directly this time. The angel of God calls from heaven and says, What is the matter, Hagar? Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy crying as he lies there. Lift the boy up and take him by the hand, for I will make him into a great nation. 2 things to notice. First, the angel calls her by name again, just like the first encounter. In a world where she's been reduced to that slave woman, God's messenger uses her name. Second, the promise from chapter 16 is repeated. I will make him into a great nation. The promise didn't expire when she was expelled. It didn't get revoked when Sarah demanded her removal. It's still active. And then comes verse 19, one of the most quietly devastating verses in the Hebrew Bible. Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. The well was already there. It was there the whole time. Hagar was sitting in the desert, dying of thirst, weeping over her child, and there was a well within sight the whole time. She just couldn't see it. The Hebrew verb is pakach, which means to open, specifically to open eyes that were closed or blinded. It's the same word used when God opens the eyes of Elisha's servant to see the armies of heaven in 2 Kings. It's the word for removing a veil, for shifting perception, for revealing what was present but hidden. The well was already there. Take a moment with that, because this isn't just an ancient survival story. This is a spiritual principle embedded in the narrative structure of the text. Sometimes the provision is already present, the answer is already there. The way forward already exists. But pain and fear and grief have a way of blinding us to what's right in front of us. And what God does for Hagar isn't magic. He doesn't create a well out of nothing. He opens her eyes to what was always within reach. If you're in a season right now where everything feels like desert, where the resources have run out and you're sitting at a distance because you can't watch the thing you love most fall apart, this verse is for you. The well might already be there. You might just need your eyes opened to see it. Hagar fills the skin with water. She gives the boy a drink, and the text says, God was with the boy as he grew up. Ishmael lives in the wilderness of Paran. He becomes an archer, and Hagar does something that reveals her enduring agency and her identity as an Egyptian. She gets him a wife from the land of Egypt. Even after everything, after decades in Abraham's household, after 2 divine encounters, after being cast out and nearly dying, Hagar's identity as an Egyptian remains. She reaches back to her own people, her own culture, her own roots to build her son's future. The text doesn't judge this. It simply records it. She's a mother providing for her child from the resources she knows. And Ishmael thrives. Genesis 25 lists his 12 sons by name, 12 princes of 12 tribes. If that number sounds familiar, it should. Jacob, Isaac's son, will also father 12 sons who become 12 tribes. The symmetry is deliberate. Ishmael's line mirrors Israel's line. 2 great nations, 2 sets of 12, 2 branches of Abraham's family tree. The text is not subtle about this parallel. Both lines receive divine promises. Both produce 12 tribal leaders. Both become nations too numerous to count. God's promise to Hagar in the desert wasn't a consolation prize. It was a parallel covenant. So here's the question you need to sit with. Why does this story matter? Not historically, not academically. Why does it matter right now, today, to you, sitting wherever you're sitting, watching this? Hagar's story is the first fully developed female narrative in the Bible. Before her, women appear in Genesis as wives, mothers, and daughters, defined by their relationships to men. Hagar is the first woman in Scripture who has her own story arc, her own encounters with God, her own promises, her own named place in the landscape. She's also the only person in Genesis who has 2 separate angelic encounters. Abraham has multiple encounters with God, but they're part of an ongoing covenantal relationship. Hagar's encounters are rescue operations. God shows up at the 2 lowest points of her life, not to make a deal, but to save her. And this is what separates Hagar's story from every other patriarchal narrative in Genesis. God's relationship with Abraham is transactional in structure. I will bless you, and you will be a blessing. I will give you land, and you will walk in faithfulness. There are terms, conditions, expectations. God's relationship with Hagar has no conditions. There's no, if you do this, I will do that. There's no covenant ceremony, no smoking fire pot passing between cut animals. God simply shows up, sees her, and makes a promise. No strings, no requirements, just grace extended to someone the world considered disposable. The theological implications of this are enormous, and they've been mostly ignored for centuries. Think about it this way. The entire Old Testament is structured around covenants. God makes a covenant with Noah, with Abraham, with Moses, with David. These covenants form the spine of the biblical narrative. And yet, before any of the major covenants are fully established, God makes an unconditional promise to an Egyptian slave woman who has no legal standing, no social power, and no claim on God's attention. What does that tell you about the character of God as the biblical authors understood it? It tells you that God's attention isn't earned. It's given. That divine concern doesn't flow downward through hierarchies of power. It flows toward need. It flows toward the person sitting alone in the desert. It flows toward the mother who has given up hope. Now, there's another layer to this story that rarely gets explored, and it connects Hagar to three of the world's major religions in ways that are both beautiful and complicated. In Judaism, Hagar's story is read with a mix of sympathy and theological complexity. The rabbinical tradition has a range of interpretations. Some midrashic texts identify Hagar with Keturah, the woman Abraham marries, after Sarah's death in Genesis 25. If that identification is correct, it means Hagar came back. After everything, after the exile, after the desert, she and Abraham found each other again. Not all scholars accept this reading, but the fact that the tradition exists tells you something about how the story resonated even in ancient times. There was a sense that Hagar's story couldn't end in the wilderness. It needed a return. In Christianity, Paul uses Hagar in his letter to the Galatians as an allegory for the Old Covenant versus the New Covenant. She represents Mount Sinai, the law, slavery. Sarah represents the New Jerusalem, freedom, grace. And, honestly, this is one of the more controversial uses of the Hagar narrative because it turns a real person's suffering into a theological metaphor. Paul's point about law and grace is valid on its own terms, but the original Genesis text paints a far more sympathetic portrait of Hagar than Paul's allegory suggests. If you read Genesis without Paul's overlay, Hagar isn't a symbol of bondage. She's a symbol of God's unexpected grace. She's the proof that God's promises aren't limited to the covenant line. That's not anti-Pauline. It's just honest about what the text actually says before later theological frameworks were applied to it. In Islam, Hagar, known as Hajar, is one of the most honored women in the faith. The Hajj, the annual pilgrimage to Mecca that every Muslim is expected to make at least once in their lifetime, includes a ritual called the Sa'i, where pilgrims walk 7 times between the hills of Safa and Marwa. This ritual directly commemorates Hagar's desperate search for water in the wilderness for her son Ishmael. Every year, millions of people reenact Hagar's steps. Her desperation, her faith, her endurance become a living, embodied act of worship. The Zamzam well in Mecca is traditionally identified as the well God revealed to Hagar. Whether or not the geography aligns perfectly with the biblical Bir Lahai-Roi, the theological connection is the same. God provides water in the desert for a woman the world discarded. 3 religions, billions of people, and at the center of all of it, a woman who started her story as someone else's property. Now I want to bring this back to something personal, because Hagar's story isn't just about theology and ancient history. It's about a pattern that plays out in ordinary human lives every single day. The pattern is this: there are people in the world who feel invisible, people who are defined by their function, not their identity, people who are used for what they can produce, not valued for who they are, people who sit in their own version of the desert, watching the last of their resources run out, unable to see the well that might already be there. Hagar's name for God, El Roi, is maybe the most intimate name for the divine in the entire Bible. It doesn't describe what God does. It describes what God is. A God who sees, not a God who merely watches, a God who sees in the way that transforms. The kind of seeing that says, I know you're there, I know what you're going through, and your story isn't over. The well Hagar named still shows up in Scripture long after she's gone. Bir Lahai Roy, the well of the living one who sees me. Isaac eventually settles there. The son of the covenant chooses to build his life at the place where the outcast met God. You could read that as coincidence, or you could read that as the text telling you that the place where the rejected encounter the divine is sacred ground, and even those born into privilege are drawn to it. Hagar entered the story as property. She exits as the mother of a nation, the namer of God, and the only woman in Genesis whose encounters with the divine rival the patriarchs themselves. She was the first to see an angel, the first to name God, the first to receive a promise of nationhood outside the covenant line, and she did it all from the lowest possible position in her society. The real question isn't whether Hagar's story matters historically. Of course it does. The real question is whether you can see yourself in it. Because Elroy didn't stop seeing people when the book of Genesis ended. The God who found a runaway slave at a desert well is the same God who sees the person watching this right now. Whatever wilderness you're walking through, whatever name you've been reduced to by people who only see your function, whatever well might be sitting just beyond your ability to perceive it right now, you are seen. That's what Hagar knew. That's what she named. And 3,000 years later, we're still talking about it. If this video changed the way you see Hagar's story, or if it helped you see something about your own story, subscribe. There are more hidden figures in the Bible whose stories have never been told the way they deserve. And we're just getting started.